The Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is indeed an honour, and I'm very pleased to rise in this House today to speak in favour of Bill C-5, an act to amend the International Transfer of Offenders Act. Madam Speaker, this legislation further strengthens our government's track record of keeping our streets and communities safe for everyone and ensuring that those who do commit crimes are held responsible for their actions. Madam Speaker, since coming into office in 2006, our government has made the safety and security of Canadians one of its top priorities. That is why we have pushed forward with a series of measures to get tough on crime, especially violent gun crime. For example, Madam Speaker, you will recall in the last session of this Parliament that any killing linked to organized crime will automatically lead to a charge of first-degree murder. To further combat the reach of organized crime, this government has also introduced legislation that imposes mandatory jail time for those involved in serious drug offences. In addition, Madam Speaker, we have passed laws that address drive-by shootings and other intentional shootings that brazenly disregard both our laws and the right of all Canadians to their safety. And, Madam Speaker, we have passed legislation that gives added protection to the police and peace officers who put their lives on the line every day that they go to work. And I certainly would like to pay tribute to the members of the Canadian Police Association who have been visiting us here on Parliament Hill the last few days. Madam Speaker, offenders have always done their best to go undetected, and the rapid pace of technological change has made this easier than ever. Hidden in the dark alleys of the information highway, offenders are attempting and often succeed at stealing the very identity of their fellow Canadians. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to remind all members of this House that this government has passed tough new laws that help the police and the courts fight the scourge of identity theft. However, Madam Speaker, the wheels of justice often turn more slowly than we would like, and as a result, there may be considerable time spent by an individual in pre-sentence custody. I'm very proud that this government has passed laws that limit the amount of credit offenders will receive while in pre-sentence custody. Madam Speaker, in this way, the guilty will serve a sentence that truly reflects the severity of their crimes. These are but a few examples of this government's efforts and accomplishments to keep our communities safer, to ensure that offenders receive appropriate sentences, and to make sure that the rights of victims are heard and respected. But as the speech from the throne notes, our work is far from over, and I am pleased that this government is already taking further action. Madam Speaker, you will recall that the Minister of Public Safety recently reintroduced legislation to strengthen the National Sex Offender Registry. This measure would provide additional protection for our children from abuse and exploitation. And with that background, I am pleased that our Conservative government has reintroduced amendments which will strengthen the International Transfer of Offenders Act. As you will recall, and as the last speaker correctly identified, Canada has been a party to international treaties relating to the transfer of offenders since 1978. Since that time, Madam Speaker, 1,531 Canadian offenders have been transferred back to Canada, while Canada has returned 127 foreign national offenders in our prisons back to their own countries of citizenship. This initial legislation, which was modernized in 2004, but now in the interests of public safety, has to be amended once again. Currently, Madam Speaker, the Minister of Public Safety is required by law to take several factors into account when considering a request for a transfer. These include, firstly, if the offender's return to Canada would constitute a threat to the security of Canada. Secondly, consideration of whether the offender left or remained outside Canada with the intention of abandoning Canada as their place of permanent residence. Third, the offender's social or family ties to Canada. And fourth, whether the foreign entity or prison system presents a serious threat to the offender's security or human rights. Madam Speaker, no doubt these are important considerations which ought to be taken into account. However, there are deficiencies. Nowhere in the current law is there any specific mention of protecting the safety and security of law-abiding Canadians. Nowhere, Madam Speaker, in the current law is there any specific mentions of victims, family members, or children. I would submit to this House, Madam Speaker, that these are serious omissions, which the bill before us will certainly correct. Moreover, Bill C-5, when passed by this House, will allow the Minister to consider a number of other factors when considering offender requests for a transfer. Specifically, the Minister of Public Safety will be able to consider situations where an offender who requests a transfer to Canada has refused to participate in career, vocational, or educational programs while incarcerated in another country. The Minister will also be able to take into account the circumstances in which the offender, if transferred to Canada, will be monitored and supervised after his or her release. This, Madam Speaker, is especially important given that one of the purposes of the Act under consideration will continue to be contributing to the administration of justice and the rehabilitation of offenders and their reintegration into the community. Madam Speaker, Bill C-5 will also allow the Minister to take into account several other very important considerations when assessing an offender request for a transfer. And these are as follows. If the offender has accepted responsibility for the offence for which they have been convicted, including acknowledging the harm done to victims and also to the community, and if the offender is likely to continue to engage in criminal activity if the transfer is successful. Madam Speaker, these considerations should surely help to guide decisions about whether to grant a request for a transfer from an offender serving a sentence outside of Canada. Currently, there is no clear legislative authority for the Minister to take those matters into account. Bill C-5 will surely remedy these deficiencies while providing the Minister more flexibility in the decision-making process itself. Now let me highlight how the proposed amendments would help keep Canadians safer, because I believe all members of the House are interested in keeping Canadians safe. The amendments before this House would add public safety as one of the purposes of this legislation. These are two simple words, but these simple words will clearly reinforce this government's commitment to ensuring that Canadians, their families, and their children are safe and secure in their communities. At the same time, Madam Speaker, the amended legislation would ensure that offenders remain accountable for their actions, both in Canada and abroad, and continue to treat fairly and equitably, and that they continue to be treated fairly and equitably when they are making a request to be transferred. The legislation as it stands empowers the Minister of Public Safety to assess an offender's potential security risk when considering a request to transfer back to Canada. However, as I indicated in my intervention with the previous speaker, the notion of a threat to the security of Canada has been linked solely to terrorism threats to Canadian people as a whole. We believe that's too narrow and must be expanded to include public safety risks to Canadians domestically and locally in their own communities. This bill will add to this by including as a factor as whether, if in the Minister's opinion, the offender's return to Canada will endanger public safety. The Minister of Public Safety will consider, among other things, the safety of victims, the safety of any child, and the safety of members of the offender's family. And Madam Speaker, to further guide the Minister's decision-making on these matters, the amendments propose other factors that would add greater flexibility in considering transfer applications. And a couple of examples as to how this might work in practice. If the offender is likely to commit criminal activity in Canada, the Minister may take this factor into consideration when entertaining the transfer request. Conversely, this legislation also has factors that would actually assist offenders in making applications successfully. For example, if an offender is in poor health or has cooperated with law enforcement officials or has acknowledged the harm he or she has done to victims in the community, the Minister may take these factors into account when considering the transfer request. I would submit to all members of this House that these are sensible changes, Madam Speaker, and moreover much needed. When the Minister assesses the potential risk from transferring an offender back to Canada, it is not enough to examine the likely threat to national security. Public safety must also be a principal consideration in that decision, and public safety has to include more than threats of terrorism. This legislation is timely, considering that it is National Victims of Crime Awareness Week, and it also ensures that helping victims of crime remains at the heart of this government's public safety and justice agendas.